The Evolution of Knowledge, History of Materials, Decades of Saltpeter. We say hi this afternoon to you from Brazil. We are Ana Maria Alfonso Golfard, Marcia Ferraz, and Silvia Weisse. Our research group at CESIMA has been conducting studies focused on the history of materials for more than 20 years now. We found that by following up a given material across time and in different societies, one might learn much about the history of scientific notions, methods and practices, questions posed, and the very idea of science such societies held. Thus, we studied many materials, metals and minerals, mineral waters, medicinal substances, balsams, dyes, foodstuffs, poisons, and so forth. The example we bring today is the one of saltpeter. For lack of time, we cannot even make a quick mention of all the epistemological, conceptual, and methodological problems posed by the nitrous compounds in the course of history. The fact that the nature of saltpeter was a matter of controversy until the beginning of the 20th century, and which much ado about the so-called true and false saltpeter, potassium nitrate and sodium nitrate respectively, suffices to illustrate our point. Besides that, we choose saltpeter for our talk today for a very curious historiographic reason. It seems nitrous compounds were absolutely unknown in classical Greece and even in the late antiquity. For instance, they are not mentioned in any of the traditional sources, from Pliny to the Greek alchemists. So, what happened for a long time in the historiography of science when something could not be traced back to the Greeks? Very interesting developments, as which we will sketch here. Our attention was called to saltpeter, or nitrous compounds in general, following the work performed by Ana Maria Alfonso Golfard with a 9th century Arabic Hermetic manuscript entitled The Book of the Treasure of Alexander. The book has 10 sections attributed to Hermes. The second is devoted to alchemy and mainly concerns the so-called softening water. These softening waters were either alkaline or acid solutions. The latter include what we know today as mineral acids, with emphasis to what at a later time came to be named as aqua fortis, this is nitric acid, and aqua regia, a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acid which are needed to dissolve gold. In addition to alchemical holy grails such as the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life, dissolved gold, this is colloidal gold, and therefore aqua regia, was needed to manufacture ruby glass, among other uses. Therefore, tracking down ruby glass as hint leads to very interesting results. Based on the lack of Greek sources, the standard tradition held that mineral acids were only known in the 13th century. The earliest historian of chemistry of the 19th century, such as Ferdinand Höfer and Hermann Kopp, as a function of the historiographical beliefs of the time, were exclusively intent in looking for links with classical Greece, which they failed to do. A second major point of interest at that time was the very identification and nomenclature of saltpeter. As a result, the attention of scholars focused in the so-called miraculous discoveries of the 13th century, the so-called aqua regia, for which use saltpeter was considered mandatory. The discovery of aqua regia and the first mention to saltpeter in the 13th century were attributed to a character named Geber. It is a corpus of alchemical writings in Latin from the 13th or early 14th century, which indeed included the very first evident recipes for preparation of nitrogen-containing acids. It was attributed to this Geber, assumedly the Latinized name of the famous Arab alchemist from the 9th century, Jabir ibn Hayyan. This widely accepted hypothesis began to be undermined by the identification of an Arabic text dated to 1214-8, which mentioned saltpeter under the name of Chinese snow, which pointed to an origin in the Far East. And worse, this text is considered more or less contemporary to the Liber Ignium Comburendos Hostis, attributed to a certain Marcus Grecus, which is the first book known to explicitly describe the use of salpetrosum, this is stone salt or saltpeter, for preparation of flying fires. Liber Ignium is a medieval compilation of recipes of incendiary weapons and explicitly describes the preparation of saltpeter. Interestingly, in the late 1800s, the famous chemist and historian of chemistry Marcellin Berthelot approached this subject and suggested some similarities with Arabic sources, terms, and ideas. But Berthelot had no knowledge of Semitic languages and tended to underestimate Arabic science, which he held to be a mere corruption of Greek science, as was common at the time among historians. For this reason, his suggestion was not taken seriously by the following generation of Orientalists in the 20th century, like Julius Ruska and Harry Stapleton. Very interestingly, the scholars call the attention to another nitrogenous material, Sal Ammoniac, as one of the innovations developed by Arabic alchemy. Now, for reasons we don't know, they didn't give any explanation for the fact the Arabs knew sal ammoniac, but not other types of nitrogenous materials like saltpeter. In any case, the status quo changed considerably in the beginning of the 20th century, together with the discovery of countless archaeological sites in ancient Mesopotamia. The thousands of documents found revealed previously unknown theoretical and technical knowledge, which perhaps could shed light on saltpeter. Because, indeed, ruby glass was found in ancient Mesopotamia archaeological sites. Within this context, Reginald Campbell Thompson played an important role. Thompson was an Assyriologist and assistant at the British Museum. During World War I, he served as captain in the intelligence service in the Middle East. When in 1918 the Middle East fell under British rule, the British Museum requested to appoint an archaeology engaged with the army to protect the antiquities, and the natural candidate was Thompson. The results of Thompson's work are detailed in Dictionary of Assyrian Chemistry and Geology. Let us see his approach to the subject, which is particularly relevant because it leads us straight to the discussion on the status of material and written evidences. Fact 1. Assyrians manufacture ruby glass. As mentioned, ruby glass contains colloidal gold. This is gold chloride. Therefore, Assyrians must have known Aqua regia. Fact 2. Assyrians seemingly knew saltpeter, which name probably was Milu, as mentioned in many medical works. Problem: saltpeter is not mentioned in the text related to chemical works. Except for a single recipe, badly mutilated, dated to the 7th century before the Common Era. This is a recipe to manufacture ruby glass, and here Thompson's approach appears clearly, as also the problems inherent to his approach, which is based on drawing inferences for missing data. To begin with, as mentioned, the text is badly mutilated, and the word gold, the essential component of ruby glass, doesn't appear in the preserved portions. Yet the recipe requires an infinitesimal amount of Q incomplete. Thomson posits it can only be Kugi, gold, Kubabar, silver, or Kupadu, another substance very complex and which he had previously discussed. Thus he inferred the only substance in infinitesimal amount that makes sense in this recipe is gold. Problem now is that now one has to prove that Assyrians knew Aqua regia. The corresponding portion of the test is irretrievably mutilated. Thomson assumed that it was precisely there where the process of obtaining of Aqua regia was described. How did he try to solve the problem? He had recourse to a process for preparation of gold chloride described in the 17th century, namely the purple of Cassius, developed by Andreas Cassius. This procedure involved green vitriol and Sal Ammoniac. After a long chain of inference of the kind we've already seen, Thomson succeeded in identifying green vitriol, and then he states, if we assume that Sal Ammoniac appears in the missing lines, then we have all the components to prepare Aqua regia. This approach was so methodological weak that not even Martin Levy, Thomson's disciple, mentioned saltpeter in the chapter on gold in his book on Mesopotamian chemistry. Yet, for all its weak grounds, it is worth observing that this procedure, feeling for missing data from other textual sources, is still done by present-day historians of alchemy or chemistry. Thomson's approach was heavily criticized by Leo Oppenheim. Oppenheim, from the Oriental Institute of Chicago, was one of the main Assyriologists of his time. In 1970, he published Glass and Glassmaking in Ancient Mesopotamia. From a methodological point of view, Oppenheim advocated a careful balance between archaeological material evidence and written sources, and as concerned the latter, in regard to Mesopotamian glassmaking, they were not homogeneous, but a compilation of documents from very different times, edited and re-edited over time for reasons and based on criteria not evident at all to modern eyes. Shortly, Oppenheim found a huge gap between the history of glass and glassmaking as told in text and the one inferred from the archaeological material evidence. In his words, their paths seldom cross. Was this gap inherent to the Mesopotamian know-how, or the information missing in the documents, a result of the many revisions, or of problems in our modern approaches to ancient sources? Oppenheim absolutely condemned any kind of inference, even the ones facilitated by the material evidence, to the point of establishing a kind of philological censorship. No assumption could be accepted without the soundest of foundations. Words of uncertain translation were to be exclusively transliterated. Any attempt at drawing historical parallels was banned. The situation was even made worse by the fact that the sources were buried under a deep layer of ritual and code, so that we can only have the barest glimpse into the effective process for manufacturing ruby glass. The result was then an impasse between Thomson's empty arguments and Oppenheim's philological censorship. This is why the identification of mineral acids in early medieval Arabic science is of paramount importance. Not only that, but the Book of the Treasure of Alexander also provides hints as to the possible route for the transmission of knowledge from ancient Mesopotamia to the medieval Arabic world. To begin with the second issue. Sabians were an enigmatic people which lived in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, possibly since the 9th century before the Common Era. They are mentioned in the Jewish Bible and also 3 times in the Quran as one of the peoples of the book. This is Jews, Christians, and Sabians. This is monotheists. Whether these were the lands of the famous Queen of Sheba is controversial. and what became of them is even more enigmatic. Let us jump to the 9th century Common Era. The medieval Arabic world gradually expands all across the Middle East and persecutes all peoples who do not convert to Islam except for the people of the book, which status afforded them protection. There was a very ancient Mesopotamian people, merely known as Haranites, for living in Haran of biblical fame, but believed to date to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. They were polytheists, and Caliph al-Mamun forced them to convert to one of the religions of the book. At this point, they alleged to be the authentic descendants of the Sabians and were saved. In the 8th and 9th centuries, Haran was one of the centers of translation of Greek sources, initially to Syriac. Following the arrival of the Arabs, translations began to be made into Arabic, which, as is known, was how large amounts of Greek science and philosophy survived until the fall of Byzantium in the 15th century. Al-Mamun was the son of Harun al-Rashid, the caliph protagonist of the Book of 1001 Nights. In turn, Al-Mamun founded the House of Wisdom and hired Hunayn ibn Ishaq to run the translation project. Why all this? Because the proof the Haranites were required to produce to attest to their status as a people of the book was obviously a sacred book or a series of sacred books. Available evidence indicates that these books combined theurgy, astrology, medicine, and alchemy, giving rise to what became known as Arabic Hermeticism. It seems that most of the sacred books of the pseudo-Sabians disappeared, but some hints allow inferring that the Book of the Treasure of Alexander was one of them. To be sure, the book begins with a section intended to demonstrate it was a legacy of the prophets. These prophets were none other than the three Hermes. Hermes the first, who learned the arts and sciences directly from the gods, Hermes the second, who developed new fields of knowledge, and Hermes the third, called Trismegistus, this is 3 times great, who wrote everything down on stone tablets upon the appearance of the first signs of the flood, as well as the offsprings of heroes and illustrious sages, including Aristotle, Alexander the Great, and Apollonius of Tyana, in addition to biblical and other mythological characters. In any case, Hermeticism reappeared in the 9th century among the Arabs, and the Haranites or pseudo-Sabians were some of the main actors involved. The Book of the Treasure of Alexander includes a series of recipes to prepare so-called softening waters, this is to say, solutions that soften materials. The acid ones were mostly used to dissolve metals, silver and gold in particular, and make them easier to be worked. Here one might follow one of two approaches. One is to go to a modern, this is a present-day laboratory, and attempt to reproduce recipes to try and identify components, reactions, and products. Or to try to reconstruct a 9th century Arabian laboratory, which to the best of our knowledge, no one has attempted to this day. While in some cases, like the recipes in the Book of the Treasure of Alexander, they are simply unreproducible due to the use of odd materials like horns of an extinct snake or exorbitant amount of ingredients. The other approach is to stick to documents and try to understand them as they are. This is the one we followed and proved to be highly fruitful. For this purpose, we asked collaboration of specialists in countless areas. Thus, without any need to go to the laboratory, we could understand, for instance, that the enormous amount of vegetable matter put to rot and the zillions of liters of donkey milk provided the right conditions for the production of nitrate and therefore nitric acid. This was the source for the first softening water, this is nitric acid, able to dissolve silver. The second softening water, in turn, was able to dissolve gold, This is Aqua regia. In this case, the source of nitrate was entirely derived from animal materials, horns, snakes, blood, and manure. These were mixed into vitriol and Sal Ammoniac, as we've already mentioned, the ingredients to prepare Aqua regia. And it's all right there in the documents, which, we must admit, demand a lot of work. For instance, the preparation of a working version of the Book of Nutrition of Alexander demanded 10 years. Yes, 10 full years of very patient and careful work. To conclude, following the modern elucidation of the nature of saltpeter, the historians of chemistry came to suggest that its history should be written based on the modern concept of saltpeter. This is to say, knowing what it effectively is today to trace it back into the past. Instead, we suggest, and indeed do, a map of the knowledge on saltpeter over time by following the hints provided by the product of its use, ruby glass and gunpowder in particular. Our approach in the case we described today and the many other case studies we conducted within this project is precisely to begin by very narrow scope case studies and the original documents with full respect for their characteristics, and in the second step to draw their relationships within wider contexts to thus obtain a temporal map of science, a map that allows room for both breaks and continuities and thus allows making assumptions impossible for conventional historiographical views. This without never leaving the basic approach to the history of science, to read text as much as possible within their context and understand the past in its own terms. Thank you very much for your attention.